Welcome, everybody. My name is Margulies, and it is an honor to have Leah Margulies here. And today is a very special day because it's going to be a wonderful conversation, very relaxed, and I'm just excited to hear the stories of the pre-code and learn more from Leah. And I'm very honored as well to have IBFAN Africa co-host, my colleague Sikembiso. I welcome you all. Leah, would you like to kindly introduce yourself?
Hello, all. I'm Leah Margulies, and I'm doing this session to talk about a bit about the history of the code and what happened in the code negotiations. And there are so many people here who know about this, who have actually participated, Anwar and Annalise and others. So being older than most of you and being the originator of the Nestle boycott, I'm very privileged to be able to share with you some of the history that resulted in the code, and then some of the events that happened in the negotiations. And I am really hopeful that Anwar will also talk about that period, because he was in the room where it happened with me. I guess I should also say that I'm a lawyer. I went to law school after working on the code, because during the code development process, I realized how important every law is, how every word in every law is very important and fought over bitterly by the people who want those laws. I ended up going to law school, and for a number of years now, I'm a legal services lawyer in New York City. That means that we provide free legal help to low-income and poor people throughout the city, and I work mainly on anti-eviction. I don't know what's going on in other countries, but we have a major eviction problem here in the US. It's a very violent attack on families to put them out of their homes. So this is what I've been doing directly in court for the last 6 years, and for 10 years previously running a online assistance for all the social legal matters that affect low-income people for New York State. That's a kind of quick summary. Oh, I forgot. Yeah, I spent years at the UN Center on Transnational Corporations, and at UNICEF. At UNICEF, I started the legal office there to help countries implement the code. I think start with a quick clip from the Senate hearings. In the US, we had hearings in the US Senate on this problem, and that this hearing led directly to the development of the code, because Senator Kennedy wanted to do something. So I'll explain it more, but I think, yeah, this is just a little excerpt.
The United States Nestle company has advised me that their research indicates this is actually an indirect attack on the free world's economic system, a worldwide church organization with the stated purpose of undermining the free enterprise system is in the forefront of this activity.
Now, you can't seriously expect we'll be in order. We'll be in order now, please. We'll be in order. Today we'll focus on one small element of the problems. We'll focus on the use of a product intended to nourish life, to enable infants to thrive and grow, to see how it can have the unintended effects of fostering malnutrition and spreading disease. We'll focus on the advertising, marketing, and promotion and the use of infant formula in developing nations. Can a product which requires clean water, good sanitation, adequate family income, and a literate parent to follow printed instructions be properly and safely used in areas where water is contaminated, sewage runs in the streets, poverty is severe, and illiteracy is high?
I'm the director of the Infant Formula Program for the Interfaith Center on Corporate Responsibility, and in my capacity, I've collected a lot of data and I have presented it over the years to the companies themselves. I think I'd like to just start in the Philippines because we've talked so much about it. So in some of our data we've collected, things like this have come out. On a Del Monte plantation, which is a workers' plantation, in the clinic there, Enfamil is given out, which is a Bristol-Myers formula free. Mead Johnson, which is the Bristol-Myers subsidiary, has practically equipped that entire nursery, supplying bassinets, scales, clocks, air conditioning, etc. In other hospitals in the Philippines, Nestle Corporation has name tags on the cribs of babies. The wristbands that they have also have the name of the formula on it. In one hospital that we surveyed, where 90% of the patients were poverty patients, 3 companies, American Home, Wyeth Division, Mead Johnson, Bristol-Myers, and Nestle's had a closed marketing arrangement with the hospital where each company would be allowed 15 days in rotation to give out their free samples. To quote a doctor from Malaysia on this problem, which he discussed this at the International Pediatric Conference in New Delhi. He said, this is Dr. Abraham, quote, "The milk companies have gained access to the health services in government and private sectors with advertising, posters, pamphlets, and free samples. These are difficult to resist because they are given free and to inexperienced health staff and seem only to be offers of much needed help." One of our investigators just wrote me from the Dominican Republic a few weeks ago, about a month ago actually, where she was investigating the problem. And right across the hall from the rehydration ward, which is where they bring back the sick babies, there was a classroom, and outside the classroom was a little bronze plaque, and it said "Classroom donated by Nestle." And inside there were lots of posters, there was formula displayed, etc.
I wanted to go back a little bit into the setting and of what was happening at that time. And I realized this morning, I also just wanted to say that when I started working at the Interfaith Center on Corporate Responsibility in 1975, the Vietnam War was just ending. This country had been convulsed for about 6 or 7 years with the war in Vietnam. And so this takes us back a ways. I got interested in looking at the ways transnational corporations were abusing human rights. And I thought it was extremely, corporations were working at a global level, and there were no, with impunity, and there were no laws. So I wanted to do something about it. I had done a lot of research on this global spread while I was in New Haven. And so I have a history. I mean, there was, I have a history of being very involved in the social movements here in this country, from anti-war to the women's liberation movement. And then all of a sudden I moved to New York, and I didn't know how I would get a job. I was 30 years old, and I didn't know what I was going to do in life. And so, having researched a lot on transnational corporations, I got a job doing some research on this book, Hungry for Profits, edited by Bob Ledigar. And there was a chapter in there called Formula for Malnutrition. And I worked on that chapter. And so I got hired at the Interfaith Center on Corporate Responsibility, and I presented this problem that I had just learned about to our board and said what was going on. What we did, what the churches were doing at that time was using their investments. This is a particular law in the US of the Securities and Exchange Commission, using their investments to raise social issues with corporations. And so I suggested, why don't we work on this problem? Because it has to do with saving the lives of babies, and there were a small group of companies involved in this market, and 3 of the major ones were US companies that the churches had investments in. So that's how it all began. I was not a nutritionist, a doctor, nothing like that. I had to learn myself about the benefits of breastfeeding and all the health issues that surround this. So we started with shareholder resolutions, and it soon morphed into a lawsuit by one of our Roman Catholic orders, the Sisters of the Precious Blood, versus Bristol Myers, because Bristol Myers had, we believe, said a number of untruthful things about their marketing in a booklet that we had asked for disclosure of their practices, and the SEC rules required companies to be truthful. So we had this lawsuit, and this is what morphed ultimately into the Nestle boycott, because and the most important thing about how we ever got strong enough to get a code at the UN, and all the work that has gone on since then, a crazy fluke of luck occurred. And that is, I went to the first women's conference sponsored by the UN in Mexico in 1975. And I really wanted to tell people about this issue that I had just begun working on. And I put up a sign. I'm so glad he's here. I put up a sign that said, anyone who wants to challenge the practices of multinational corporations, come to a certain room. And only one person showed up, and that person was Anwar Fazal. And if I hadn't met Anwar in 1975, I don't know if all of this could have happened, because for the first time, I was able to relate to an international network of people who were concerned about these issues. At that time, well, I'll let Anwar speak for himself later, but that was just a chance meeting, and it meant everything, because when we were collecting data about the practices of, I was hoping just Bristol Myers, but it actually was the practices of all the companies, the teams that IOCU, International Organizations of Consumer Unions, that Anwar was leading, they all helped and participated. And we ended up getting affidavits from 19 third world countries into this lawsuit. There was also a very important trajectory for me personally in this, because I also, right before we filed all these papers, went myself to Jamaica and Venezuela. First time I saw firsthand what bottle feeding did to babies. I visited the Caracas Children's Hospital emergency room, at which point, when I was there, there were 52 babies lined up being rehydrated. And it was like an eye-opener for me to see that. And I took this picture myself. Magdalena has a photograph. And I was stunned. So we ended up starting this boycott, and it grew very quickly. And the reason I brought the Vietnam War in, it was the Vietnam War was ending, and there was a lot of unrest and social concern coming out of that. But I was working in the churches, and the churches in the US had been actually very involved in ending the war. And I really wanted, at this point, I wasn't just into healthcare. I did want people to learn about what transnational corporations were doing and why it was important to try to put some social controls on it. Lena wanted me to tell some funny stories, so I am going to tell a funny story now that also led to the Senate, to what happened at the Senate hearing. So while I was in Jamaica, I was there with the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation crew, and we were doing a documentary, and I just happened upon a milk nurse from Mead Johnson in the hospital that I was visiting. And I asked her what she was doing. And she said, well, I'm just taking the names of everybody who is here so that I can go and visit them, get their addresses and everything. And so we presented that to the Minister of Health of Jamaica at the time, and she was horrified because Jamaica was one of the first countries that had a law that forbade milk nurses from going into the hospitals. So basically, that revelation grew into our first major victory that was announced at the Senate hearing. So what happened is, after we launched the boycott, and I think you have a picture of, and we developed an ad for the back cover of Mother Jones magazine, a very public magazine here. For this first time, did a lot of direct mail. So the boycott grew like wildfire on college, universities, all kinds of institutions around the country. The major Protestant denominations supported the boycott. The American Public Health Association joined the boycott. I mean, it was very vast, and we wanted to do something more. So we went to visit Senator Kennedy's staff and asked him to hold a hearing, and he said, well, we would hold a hearing, but we need to know that this is actually an issue that people care about. And so we organized a letter writing campaign. This is way before the internet. And we got more than 50,000 letters into Senator Kennedy to ask him for this hearing. And I just wanted to show you all, so I showed Hungry for Profits. This is the hearing book. This is all the testimony that was collected at this hearing. And we did that little piece of the hearing. The room just fell into laughter when Kennedy said that to the Nestle guy. So what happened at the hearing was that Mead Johnson, makers of Enfamil, announced for the first time that they were going to stop using milk nurses because they had sent a very famous woman in the US Bess Meyerson. I know you all don't know her, but in the US, she was very famous and a big famous consumer advocate. So they had sent her to Jamaica at the same time as me. And she was horrified when I arranged a meeting with her at the Rockefeller Foundation to tell her what had actually happened in Jamaica. And she was really, she was on the board of a major consumer organization here. So anyway, that was why we got the first company to renounce milk nurses. So basically, what happened is Kennedy had the kind of clout that nobody else had. And he went to WHO and asked WHO to do something. And so I'm not sure how it led to the 79 meeting, but it did. WHO hosted a meeting. It was in October of 1979, and this is the official roster. So Anwar attended this meeting, and I attended this meeting, and there were a few other people. Andy Chetley, who was already working on this issue in England after Mike Muller published the booklet for War and Want on the baby killer. So in those early years, I began to learn about the other groups in Europe that were also working on this issue, and also some of the major doctors who were working on this issue, like Dr. Jelliffe and Dr. Clavano in the Philippines, both of whom testified at the Senate hearing.
Anwar, would you like to share about your first encounter with Lee? And I'm so happy to finally meet you. Thank you.
Thank you. It's such a joy to be here with what I've worked with for years and years, decades, and I'm still working with them because of my engagement with the World Alliance for Breastfeeding Action. I was a breastfed baby from 1941, just when World War II was begun. I was the eldest, and every one of our children were all breastfed. So I grew in an atmosphere where breastfeeding was such a natural thing. And my engagement with engaging in making change on this issue because of the multinational corporations getting engaged began with my founding of the Consumers Association. And it's the consumer movement that Leah was talking about also that became a very major actor in the world because it brought to us organizations who were at that time in 80 countries or so, now even very, very much more. And they became engaged in this. I was asked, I had set up a breastfeeding group within the CAP, Consumer Association of Penang, way back in 1970-71. And when I was then asked, I chaired a conference of Asia for the consumer movement. They asked me to set up an office, and the office was set up in Singapore. And once the office was set up, various UN agencies that were in the region began to engage with me. And we had conferences relating to FAO, relating to UNICEF in Jakarta, in Bangkok. And of course, IACU was very much involved in Codex and had raised the issue of codes relating to nutrition and food. And in that, the issues of breastfeeding were mentioned, but they were part of a whole collection of things. But we became a bit more serious after this setup of the Asia office, because I was asked to be part of the UN subcommittee on nutrition. that met in Denmark and several other places. I was even asked by FAO to help them under Codex to set up an international code on nutrition of foods. And that gave me an opportunity to work in Rome for a while with the UN, where I drafted a whole document about marketing, covering all kinds of nutrition foods, in which I mentioned breastfeeding. So this engagement made me very, very open. At that time, in January 1975, the UN was holding the World Conference on Women, and the International Organization of Consumers Union wanted to be represented. And they were looking at the issues, and there was only one person within the movement at that time who knew about women's issues, because I was working on issues relating to breastfeeding. I was working on issues relating to how poisons and the cosmetics and all those things, the pesticides being used by women. I was working on all those kinds of issues when I was in the consumer movement. So they asked me to go there, one of the few men who was present. And for me, I made a presentation, and that led me to go to Mauritius and Hong Kong after that to help them set up their movements in that area. And there I met, it was such a joy to meet someone with whom I could relate with on these issues. And we became partners. And as a result of it, we began to link up and for the work that was being done by the Interfaith Corporate Responsibility Group, the groups that were in the UK at that time with the consumer movement, people like Charles Medawar, the Vaughan Want, and Andy, a whole range of people all over the world emerged. And we actually had a very quick framework that enabled us to be really, you could say, going global and strongly so, with professions in there, with the churches in there with us, with consumer movements there with us, people who are interested in justice were with us. I never forgot one of the things that happened in New York when Leah was working there, of how a journalist infiltrated, offered to volunteer to work for the Interfaith Center. And then after some time there, he wrote an article for a major newspaper which said, "Activists under the banner of Christ." Yeah, where he was saying how
it wasn't just a major newspaper. It was Fortune magazine.
Fortune magazine.
Yeah. But yeah, he wasn't really undercover there. But yes, he did that article.
And that kind of, infiltrations also was something that we had to deal with. Gifa also remember how in Geneva there was an effort. There was a time when one of the major corporations had a new person who was in charge of security within the company, and that person happened to be a former MI5 person, and that's equivalent of the CIA. And he was put head of Nestle. And he began also an effort of trying to infiltrate and begin to confront us. I mentioned these things because there were really challenges out there, corporations and even sometimes corporations having influence on governments, trying to harass us, trying to undermine with us, but they never succeeded. I mean, we fought on. We are such a good global network, north and south, which was very unusual at that time. We had a global network that got so many different professions engaged. We got governments who became interested in our work, particularly in the Scandinavian countries. And when we had this north-south strong relationship and this global networking, third world people involved, it really became a global issue. And the setting up of, with our meeting there, we decided that this type of work is going to be forever and ever and ever. And we thought we'll start a network that will begin. And it was the first ever international organization that used the word network, which, so many years ago, half a century ago, was an unknown word, but we use that word. And nowadays, of course, networking is everywhere. And it was also a light action participatory network. That was, it was what I used to call a love affair. We all didn't have to necessarily submit organizations. We took organizations that were already working and we just engaged them together. And once they linked together and they had connected, when we wanted a newsletter, we said, the World Council of Churches, you got a newsletter, why don't you put something up for us inside that? And so this way we just grew, and IOQ became a base also for IBFAN. So when IBFAN was started, we had very early funding. One of the early fundings we had from Canada. They would only give the money to the third world. So we got the money in the third world, but we got Doug Clement to work for us. And he was one of the early employees. And of course,
from IBFAN,
moved on, and Jean-Pierre came on with us. And we had in the South also a presence of some of the core people, and Penang became the center of the International Code Documentation Center and played a very, very important role. And then, of course, later, with the Innocenti Declaration, we had also the founding of another major network that embraced another document which itself had its own challenges. I'll stop here for a while.
Anwar, I want to go back to the code development process, because what happened at that 79 meeting set the tone, and also it was the birth of IBFAN, and that's what I want to just talk about. So at this meeting that WHO hosted, there were 5 working groups, and they included things like encouraging and supporting breastfeeding, promotion and support of appropriate weaning, the health status of women. So there were this was a meeting of about 100 people, but they were just a handful of activists. And to the best of my knowledge, and I think Anwar will agree, it was the first time that non-official, that NGOs that didn't have official relations with WHO were invited to participate in a meeting, and we were activists. We had never been into anything like this. And so we were invited in, and that was largely because of our role with Kennedy. But one of the working groups had to do with the marketing. And so Anwar and I were in the working group with the corporate executives. And so I'm going to tell a couple of funny stories that happened there that led to the code development. So each group had to produce, you know what the UN is like, you have to produce reports. So every group had to produce a report. And also those of us who were engaged in this work stayed at the John Knox Center, and every night we would have a meeting. And Anwar actually would chair these meetings, and he explained that because we were just a brand new little network that we named IBFAN, and it was just a handful of us, he called it smoke and mirrors. We had to act like we had smoke and mirrors to seem stronger than we were. Meeting at night when we realized that nothing was going to happen in the marketing group because we were fighting with the corporations about their practices, we decided that each group should include in their report that a code of marketing should be developed, so that when the final report came out, it would be 4 out of the 5 groups would have that as part of their recommendations. What happened in our group is it fell apart because we in the US had gotten a hold of one of the secret training manuals for the salespeople for infant formula sales. And I started reading from the manual in this meeting. And the part that said you should go and visit the nurses late at night on the night shift, because that's a good time to get them to kind of warm up to you and accept your free supplies and all the marketing materials. And the place went into uproar. I don't know if you remember this, Anwar, but the chair of the meeting, of the whole meeting, was the equivalent of the Minister of Health for Switzerland. And the meeting, he called a recess to our meeting. We had a 2-hour recess, during which at the end, we found out that he resigned because he felt that he would get fired from his job, because that's how powerful Nestle was in Switzerland. And they had all kinds of laws there. You're not allowed to challenge corporations. And he resigned. And so after a 2-hour break, we all of a sudden had a new chairperson of our working group and a new chairperson for the meeting itself. And if I remember correctly, it was the Minister of Health from Nigeria, whose name I forget. I'm so sorry, but I forgot his name. But
he was from Ghana.
Brilliant. What?
Yeah. Ghana.
Oh, it's
I think
Ghana?
He was from Ghana.
Ghana.
In Ghana.
He
yeah.
was brilliant.
Right,
I
right.
wanted to explain a little something about the code development process. So we had IBFAN now. And so WHO would produce new versions of the code. They produce like 3 or 4 versions over the course of the 2 years of negotiations. And each time they produced a version, either one would be sort of more pro what the corporations wanted, and then we would file all these papers protesting it. And each time they produced a version of the code, they would hold meetings with the various groups. Sometimes separately, they would hold meeting with the corporations. Then they would hold meetings with the activists, and they would hold, and each time they would include, health professionals. And so there were like 3 or 4 versions of the code before we got to the code itself. But the final code and so we contributed our thinking about each section over this course of 2 years. And then when it came to the final vote, yes, we heard the day before the actual vote that because Ronald Reagan had been elected as president in the US, and he was inaugurated right in January. I guess it was right before the executive board meeting, but it was announced the day before the code vote that the US would vote no. And that was like really unheard of in the UN, because the UN is always seeking consensus. So we also heard that Guatemala was going to vote no on the code. And we were shocked because Guatemala already had a very good pro-breastfeeding policy that included restrictions on marketing. And what happened the day before on the assembly floor, and these are some of the funny stories that I wanted to tell you where just luck happened. I was informed by one of the WHO people from who was Guatemalan that Guatemala had a Nestle person sitting in on their delegation, and they didn't think they were credentialed to be there. And so he told me how to make an official complaint to WHO about this person being in the Nestle delegation, and which I did. And so this very embarrassing thing happened. security people walked onto the floor of the assembly in the middle of a meeting and asked this Nestle doctor for his credentials, which of course he didn't have, and they removed him. Guatemala was so embarrassed by this event that Guatemala switched to a yes vote. So in the end, the US stood alone as the only no vote on the code. And this was also particularly upsetting because during the Carter administration, which preceded Reagan, they were involved in being in the code, and they were instrumental in getting WHO to reduce the regulatory status of the code, because it was originally supposed to be a regulation within the WHO system and not a resolution. And so they were instrumental in watering down the code. We fought against it, but we lost that part. And then the irony was Reagan came in and said that this code was an attack on the free world economic system, and voted no. But that in the end turned to our advantage because it elevated the issue. And in that 1 year, we got 5,000 press articles. And maybe you could show that cover. This is just a small sampling that we put together. We have a whole booklet that had all kinds of, because it caused a lot of journalists who are cartoonists to create hysterical cartoons all over the world. This is one page of it. So anyway, I guess the purpose of this is to show that the code did not come out of the ether. It was the result of the work of thousands and thousands of people all around the world. And at the height of the boycott, we in the US had more than 30 people employed at INFACT, working all around the country, organizing the boycott. And it grew. So I was trying to show the history so you could get an idea of how we ended up with this code. And I still think of the code as really a benchmark to that hasn't been repeated in the same way. I had a meeting with Halfdan Mahler, the Director General of WHO, during that 1981 World Health Assembly. And he told me personally that his life was threatened by the pharmaceutical companies when WHO published those first lists of the drugs. It was, what was that drug list called? It was
Essential
like the
drugs.
what? The essential drugs list. Yes, and don't forget the pharmaceutical companies, those are, except for Nestle and a few others, those are the infant formula companies, same companies.
Yeah, that's so interesting. I'm gonna bring in Bill Jeffrey.
Okay, I'll just start now. It's Bill Jeffrey. Hi, Leah. It's really great to hear this story. I've heard bits and pieces, and I read Sammy Schuber's, the former legal counsel for the World Health Organization, and his account, similar to yours. I thought he said that initially it was going to be a treaty, and then the Carter administration said they would prefer that it was a code. And then ultimately, when Reagan came in, they didn't even agree to that. But if it had been a treaty, then all of this differences of between the standards and codex would have not mattered because the treaty would have prevailed. But my question is, I wasn't aware that you had started the legal office at UNICEF, and I did a little bit of that recently between 2018 and 2022 to assist governments in implementing the code. But the kind of meta question that I had through all of that work is, when all of these governments are going to Geneva and every 2 years and saying the code is great and let's particularize it a little bit more, or let's say that we agree with it once again with all these resolutions. I think it's 20 now since since 1981. Why is it that when they're domestically implementing it, every single one of them ignore parts of the code? It's always a partial thing. Sometimes it's more than others, but is it all just industry pressure, or is it carelessness? You know?
It's industry pressure. This industry is so powerful, and they control their financing is so much bigger. They've used their weight to influence. I mean, it's amazing to me that that we've been able to fight back for so long, and I applaud all of you who have worked on this for so long, and this industry is very, very powerful. You can't have a more powerful industry than the combination of pharmaceuticals and food companies. I mean, so their economies are so much greater.
The question after Bill was a question from Italy, Adriano. Adriano was asking about the original naming of the code, whether it was originally named. I'm not sure whether Adriano wants to ask the question live. Adriano, IBFAN Italy.
Yes, it's me. But my question is already being answered by Bill, because he said that it was a treaty. I thought it was a regulation, in fact.
Yeah, the WHO I think the first treaty that ever came out of WHO is the tobacco treaty. They never got to an international treaty before. And that was like, what, in the 80s or 90s, I guess it was in the 90s. So the three levels are treaty, regulation, and resolution. And so as I said, the Carter administration was instrumental in reducing its regulatory status. So it really is still just a set of recommendations. I completely agree with Bill.
Hilary Johnson from INFACT Canada, please feel free to ask your question.
Leah, you told us the story about the Minister of Health, or equivalent to, from, if I remember correctly, Switzerland.
Yes.
Who, after the 2-hour pause, didn't return to serve as chair. Now, the specific words I remember you saying are that he something about job. He
resigned.
He felt
so when you say he resigned from his job, do you mean he resigned from the job of chairing that meeting, or he resigned from the job of being Minister of Health?
No, he resigned from the job of chairing the meeting.
Okay, thank you for that clarification.
He felt that even his presence at that meeting would potentially jeopardize his job. And this is reported to me by people at WHO. So, but after the 2-hour break, what happened when we reconvened is Abbott Laboratories representatives said, yes, that is really a detailing book from Abbott Labs, makers of Similac, and it really changed the tone of the meeting when this event occurred. It gave us a chance to go through more directly with the corporate executives, you know, what practices we were trying to stop. And because where I was sitting at that time as staff at the Interfaith Center on Corporate Responsibility, I had met with many of these people before in meetings in New York and at their annual meetings. And so, you know, they knew exactly what we wanted, and they just were going to fight back. And that's been the story for these last 40 years, is just they're very powerful and they've fought back.
Patty Rundle, OBE, is Baby Milk Action's Policy Director. Thank you, Patty.
It's been fantastic to hear you, Leah. I think it's really amazing. And thanks to Magdalena for allowing this space. It's fantastic. And I think those of us who've been following WHO and everything, you know, I mean, it's all that pressure on the UN to partner up. I mean, that's been the major problem for us over the years. First of all, getting the code in first, and then going on and getting governments to do it and take it seriously. But then, you know, from about 2000, in terms of my understanding, you know, you had the whole phenomenon of the Bill Gates coming in and offering funding to WHO in exchange for a totally different way of working, or a continuation of the way of working, I should say. It's not a different way of working, but that has been a major problem for us. And and the Bill Gates sort of approach with the scaling up nutrition and others has been talking about actually taking a more collaborative approach with corporations. And the code has been seen as this sort of like problem, you know, always having a look at, you know, and coming back and reporting, getting companies to come back and report every 2 years. You know, the corporates don't like it. And in the US, never liked it. Somebody asked, I think, Britta, you asked the question of when did the US eventually sign up to the code? They did. My understanding of it wasn't that they ever signed up to it, but in 2000, in the Clinton administration, so we're talking, oh God, get the decade.
The 90s. It was the 90s because...
And it was 94 and 96 with there was this, you know, one, I can't remember what it was about, free supplies or one of the other things. And we isolated the US and said, you know, they would be on their own if they actually opposed it. So they didn't. And they agreed. And that was the first time during the time that I've been following it, that there was consensus. And then until you got to Trump. As soon as Trump came in, then it was all out war in a way that we've never seen before. I mean, I've never witnessed such awful language, either at Codex or at WHO. And of course, we're here now at Codex, and there's that whole struggle about the fact that these products are ultra processed products and they're globally traded. And, you know, thank heavens, IBFAN has stayed on in there since 1995, since the, you know, the whole business of actually the challenge to companies. This is my understanding, that every time a country wants to go further, then you get a challenge from the US that this isn't, that the code and the resolutions are not proper standards, and that they're not recognized. And we've got some wonderful researchers now who've actually documented every time, and it's really been proven that that's what the US has been doing. Well, I think it's because we've exposed all this, and we've said all the time, for God's sake, you've got to talk about trade, you've got to bring up these things, you've got to do something about this, because we're never going to get, unless the Codex is not is in line with what WHO is saying, forget it. You know, it's just not going to happen.
Yeah, in fact, I do know there was, the US has interfered in certain country code development and accusing the government of trade violations, and they've used that as a cudgel against countries, because then what happens at the country level is the Ministry of Health is at odds with the Ministry of Trade, and trade always wins, or almost always wins. And so this is why this is such a long struggle, and how I really have to admire all of you for continuing this fight. I want to say that I didn't leave UNICEF willingly. I was fired after two US former secretaries of state became lobbyists for the infant formula companies. And I know for sure Cyrus Vance visited UNICEF, and it was a very difficult time at UNICEF because I was being protected by the highest up at UNICEF, Jim Grant, the director, and the deputy director at that time, Dr. Nini. They protected what I was doing, but Jim Grant got very sick. I mean, it was a lot of politics. Let's just leave it at that. And I did want to, this does remind me, I did want to tell you another funny story from the past. So forgive me, I'm going to just say this. When I was, before the 79 meeting, I got a phone call from UNICEF. I was totally shocked. I mean, I have to tell you, I was an activist. You know, that's how I got into this. And I got a call from UNICEF. Would I come and meet with somebody named Richard Hayward? And I didn't know who he was. I said, sure, okay, I'll come. And so I went with my colleague Ed Baer, that some of you remember, and we went to UNICEF, and the names of people and their titles were by the office. And we get to Dick Hayward's office and we find out he's deputy director of UNICEF. And we're like, oh my gosh, why does this guy want to talk to us? And so we meet with him. He was a wonderful person, actually. And he worked hard on the code, and I worked with him on lots of wording during the negotiations. But he called me in and he said, WHO, harumph, he was already a senior, and harumph, WHO wants you to call off your press conference and call off the demonstration on the steps of WHO. And I said, no, first of all, there is no demonstration on the steps of WHO. Why would we demonstrate? We're invited into the meeting. So we're not going to have a demonstration. We're thrilled. But I said, but we're not going to call off our press conference. And we had scheduled it for the press room at the UN, at WHO. And they evicted us from that press conference. But of course, because ICCR worked with the World Council of Churches, I called the World Council of Churches and I explained what happened. And they invited us to use their room for the press conference. And of course that it was every time something like this happened, it would backfire and give us more publicity. So all of a sudden, all this press came that wouldn't have been at the UN press room. So it's just one of those funny stories. But Dick Hayward later became really a good friend, and he worked very hard on trying to get the best wording into the code, actually. I just had to tell this story because it's funny.
I love, Leah, I love that story, and I wish you would share more of the funny stories, but will you share the story about your suit? I think these things are published, and I think people should hear these stories.
Right. Yeah, that's a very funny story. So at the Senate hearing, I had bought a suit to wear to the Senate hearing, and it was the first suit that I think I maybe ever had, because I wore jeans and things like that to work. And so I thought, oh, I better dress better and look the part more at this Senate hearing, which, by the way, we had worked with them very hard on organizing and getting all the people invited. And WHO came in, first time they ever testified at a US legislative hearing. They came, it was really quite something. And so I bought a suit and I went, and my friends were sitting like near where the corporate executives were sitting. And they heard them saying, oh, look at that cheap suit that she's wearing.
Who is it? What were they, the companies?
Oh, it was like the US companies, Bristol Myers, the makers of Enfamil, Similac, and SMA.
Wow.
And they were all chatting among themselves about that cheap suit I was wearing. I remember it cost $42, and that was a lot of money for me in those years.
That was 1978.
Yeah.
Wow. Are you there, brother? I
So
will pass the question time to you.
All right, but yeah, there is an itchy hand from Hilary Johnson. Maybe she can go through and then we can hand over to Leah again. That was the only itchy question for now. Hilary?
I just was really interested to learn about how many people were employed by InFact USA during that boycott. And I wanted to share how delighted I am to see that once again, there is an active InFact USA entity. I'm very clear that in the North American environment, it is exactly what you described about the 50,000 letters to Senator Kennedy. That's political will. Political will doesn't come from the politicians.
No.
You know, there are countries that have enacted the code because somebody high up decided to enact it. But the way it's going to happen in North America, it's got to come from citizens.
Bill was asking about the Nestle scientist who is with WHO for 8 years and so on, but I will give it to Bill to ask the question and then Katie after that.
I discovered a couple of years ago that a scientist who came to WHO after working at Nestle for 8 years and remained at the World Health Organization from 2011 to 2019, so another 8 years, and now works for Nestle or for Danone. And I just, to me, it seems kind of unconscionable that the WHO would hire someone from Nestle. And I don't remember there being a fuss about it, but anyway, I'm just curious what to make of it.
It just shows, that there's a real inconsistency. That's such a conflict of interest. And, it would have had the only way that could have been challenged. It can't really come directly from IBFAN. We have to have a government person who would be willing to raise that. That would be my opinion, that the way to get things more accomplished that we would want, we have to work with and through government representatives because, this is the UN. So I think what we learned in the code debate, and then which Patty and Annalise and everyone took forward into Codex and other areas, is the ability to raise issues and talk with people who are actually the ones that need to raise them, which are the government representatives. And it just made me remember, I wanted to show, and maybe we could show this. So I don't know if you can see this, but during all of these World Health Assemblies, we, out of ICCR, we produced a whole series of, I called them one pages, where we would just try to synthesize in one page the major issues that we wanted the government delegates to know about. Because people would come, and this is important to know, people would be, come from their countries, they would be selected, they wouldn't know all about the issues that were on the agenda necessarily. And in fact, I did want to raise this during the assembly. The infant formula companies sent country delegates on junkets around Europe. They tried to buy them off. I was told by WHO they were offering prostitutes to people. I mean, this is a very corrupt industry. And they'll do anything, really, literally, short of, well, actually,
they've killed people.
They've done everything. They tried to destroy Dr. Clavano. These people are ruthless. Yeah. They have no scruples whatsoever. And so, anyway, I produced a whole series of things, one on breast versus bottle, the scientific evidence. So we had a whole series of things, and they were all these one pages that we could give out to the delegates and try to educate them so they would understand what we were asking them to do. There are a bunch of other pictures, some early IBFAN pictures from the Philippines, and some great photos of Anwar.
Yes. and there's
Anwar poking out. I think this was Manila, right, Anwar?
That's right.
Or Inez?
Yeah, that's Manila.
Yeah, that was amazing.
That was really good.
Yeah.
Leah, are there any other photos you'd like me to share? I have a whole folder here.
Oh, I would like you to share the picture. So in one of those meetings, and I don't remember whether it was the 79 meeting or maybe after, but we hung an INFACT banner over the Nestle sign in Nestle headquarters in Switzerland. And yes, I'd like you to see. Yeah, we went out, the people from Arbeitsgruppe Dritte Welt. So early on in, I guess it was 74, this Third World Action Group from Switzerland republished Mike Muller's, it was 76 maybe, republished Mike Muller's book as Nestle Kills Babies, and they were sued by Nestle. And they ended up being fined $1 because of the laws of Switzerland. They had to be found guilty, but were fined like the equivalent of $1. And anyway, that's the people from that group. They drove me out to Nestle headquarters, and we did this sign. That was lots of fun. We did fun things like that. We were young, and that's the main thing is, we have to attract young people because they have the energy and the grit and the time to really run a movement. It takes a lot of energy. I mean, when we had 30 people as staff, we also had to raise the money to support the 30 people as staff. I mean, it was very hard. We had the advice of one of the organizers of the farm workers boycott worked with us, and we did a lot of on the ground organizing. we had teams in certain cities, and yeah, it was a huge project. It took young people to do it, really.
What we're trying to do more in IBFAN is to bring youth, because action is in the IBFAN's title.
Yes.
Alice?
The issue of the code is a very important thing. Here in Nigeria, we have a lot of problems with infant food manufacturers confusing professional colleagues, setting up various forms of support to get them to promote their products. I am happy that the NAFDAC and other bodies are also rising to the challenge, but they need a lot of support to make this fight to achieve the purpose they want it to achieve. I'm happy to be in the meeting. Thank you for all the efforts. I believe it is getting better. It's not as blatant as it used to be, where infant food manufacturers walk into the hospital, hold the events. Many more people are getting sensitized and aware of the implications of these code violations wherever it is carried out. Thank you very much.
Alice, thank
you.
you. Alice, thank
Alice,
you so much. Annalise from Malaysia.
Hi.
Annalise, you're very welcome. Please go ahead.
Okay. I don't know what else to add to the many things that Leah told us about the beginning of the international code. One thing I do remember that in 1981, when the code was being produced and was being offered to the World Health Assembly, the one vote against took a lot of people, a lot of days, and a lot of effort to achieve. You know, we had 60 people. This is only 1 year after IBFAN was formed. Well, 2 years.
Yeah.
2 years, and we had 60 people, and each one of them were allocated certain countries that might vote against, like you mentioned, Guatemala. There were other countries as well.
Yeah.
And they did a fantastic job. And we really had a big win with the one vote against and only 3 abstentions. And they were understandable.
Yeah.
So that was one thing. As far as treaty and recommendation and regulation, I know that there are only 2 treaties as far as now in WHO. That after treaty, you said rightly, there is the regulation. We try to have the code adopted as a regulation.
Yeah.
Again, because of the US. Some compromise was made and it was a resolution. And so every 2 years, IBFAN had to be there and to bring in people and lobby governments, lots of times. So yeah, the story goes on after what Leah told us.
Yeah, this was really a history.
Yeah. Okay, Magdalena, yeah.
Yes, thank you so much. It's so good to see you both.
Just one thing, I remember, you know, because we have had the boycott all this time and going on and on and on. But one time I was at a meeting in Norway with Thad Jackson and WHO, and it was all about NCDs, you know, obesity and everything. And Nestle admitted, Thad Jackson admitted that actually it would have been better for Nestle if it had been a regulation. That actually at the time they fought against it, but because the boycott was, we actually kept it going, and they got a reputation trashed, you know, all these years. When you think about it, people will not, certainly in England and where the boycott is things, you know, just, I mean, less now, but it was an admission. And I thought, you know, to say that actually they would have preferred it if it had been a regulation, had been done and dusted. They would have then got round it, of course. But that was his comment.
And now we have Noma Joni, or as I like to call her, my beloved Mama Noma, from IBFAN, Africa.
I'd also like to share something about the code. I remember in 1984, in Swaziland, we hosted the first Africa meeting on breastfeeding. Annalise, Petty, this was hosted with Fiona Duby, Petty, Annalise, I can't remember the other people. I was new in IBFAN. They came over to present the code and then unpacking the code, as it was such a complicated legal document. We never even thought that we would understand the code. I'm so happy today that the code is being understood, simplified, a lot of people knowing about the code. And also, I think when you look at the state of the report for WHO, UNICEF and IBFAN, we're seeing that the African countries have got more national laws that are substantially aligned to the code, but not enough. But compared to the continent, to the world, we've got more of those in Africa. So the challenge now is to be the implementation and enforcement of those laws, because even where the countries have some measures, but they've implemented some of those measures successfully. For instance, I'll make an example for Swaziland, where a measure was implemented to stop a company manufacturing baby food, though the country did not have a national law.
Because Africa has some of the best laws, national laws, that we all work together to protect them. And I think we have 30 IBFANers on this call now, you know, to continue protecting the actual law that protects, because we have a Sun Movement and GAIN, which Gates funded, and IBFAN has done a lot of research and have found out that sometimes, you know, like the Kenya case, behind the scenes, undermining the legislation. And that's very frightening, because breastfeeding can mean the difference between life and death, especially for our children in, for example, Zimbabwe, where their code covered children 5 years. And I think it's really important we continue fighting to protect the women and children. You know, I always use the Zimbabwe example. When people say to me, oh, please share good examples, Zimbabwe, Fiji, and for them, you know, to hear the challenges they face, we have to really support.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So at least we do have the young ones like Alice, who are dynamic and sort of ready and fire.
Yeah.
Annalise used to say we are fast, furious. I never got it right. Annalise. Flexible. Fast, furious, and flexible. We've got the young people now in Africa that are fast, furious, and flexible. So we need to real serious, on a serious note, we need a lot of effort. The pressure to government is very high from the industry, and the economy is not on their side. So the temptation to listen to the industry is higher than it was before, though we have all those national laws.
Coming back to the history, may I say something? Is Marina here?
Yes,
Oh,
Marina.
Hi,
Marina.
Hi, how are you all? I'm thinking, going back to the past, what Annalise said about times that we went there to WHO for the assemblies and to push the resolutions. And I remember well a resolution of infants who have to be fed on breast milk substitutes in 1986. Yeah. No, I just want to ask if Leah and Annalise can add something more in relation to this achievement that we did in relation to Article 6 of the code, that we felt that it could be the article that the companies will change or will skip or whatever. And so would be important to have the modification and the importance of having an ally inside WHO. I don't remember
Yes.
his name. It was a person from Guatemala and he was in
Yes.
nutrition. I don't remember his name. Do you remember?
Yeah, yes, I have it right in front of me on the list of participants. Where did I put it? Yeah, he was absolutely Moises Behar.
Yeah,
Dr.
yeah.
Behar.
Mo-
He
Mo-
was fabulous.
Moses
Yeah.
Behar. Yes, yes.
I just wanted to acknowledge Rosemary from Trinidad and Tobago. I'm clicking ask to unmute. I don't think I have the power to unmute. I don't have that much power on Zoom. I'm very weak, but I try my best. Okay. Rosemary, please, you have the floor. I'd love to hear from you.
Thank you so much. It's really wonderful to be here this morning. I am here representing the Breastfeeding Association of Trinidad and Tobago, which has really acted for IBFAN Caribbean from the beginning. We actually had someone in Geneva. I don't know if any of you remember her. Her name was Hazel Brown, and she was there. She wrote a lovely article about her experiences, which I did share with Magdalena. She was there in the beginning when, as you said, nobody really knew anything much about what they were doing as activists. They were from NGOs, and she talked about the tremendous lobbying that went on even then, whether it was in the coffee shops or, she said, in the elevators and in the restaurants. And they learned so much about this dealing with these corporate bodies. And she went on to be the representative for IBFAN Caribbean. And in actual fact, within about 2 years, we did get a labeling law in Trinidad and Tobago, which was aligned to the code. We did have it established in the beginning. We have been acting very much as a watchdog for the code in this region for probably nearly 30 years now. I agree so much about needing to get the younger ones involved, because I always feel that there's so many of us now kind of in our 70s and 80s, and you hear these wonderful stories of the work that was done and the enthusiasm, and you just hope that is going to continue.
A co-leader, Sikembiso, for the youth, for the campaigns and youth group, one of our questions that we're asking ourselves is, how can we make the code cool for young people? You know, and it's going to be really interesting, and just so grateful to Leah, to Patty, to Annalise, to Marina, to Mama Noma, Ma Ines, so many great mentors. But now is the time to mentor the young people. I'm old. IBFAN calls me youth. I'm 44. And I was like, oh my God, they think I'm young. I'm old. So I'm very grateful, but I'm also conscious that we need to make a safe space for young people to come and be mentored. We really think about that and bring in.
Yeah. I know. Yeah, we have, this won't live unless we get young people involved.
I think we're done.
I think we're done. I'm very grateful. I'm very grateful for this opportunity, and I'm really looking forward to connecting with people. So I'm so happy to be able to reconnect, be part of this, and it's a real privilege. And I thank you all for all the work you've done all these many years. It's really incredible. And all I can say is a chance meeting with Anwar Fazell in 1975 led to all of this. And so it's really amazing.
Oh, thank you, Leah. Just
quickly.
one thing, before you all disappear, can we have a group photo? Oh, there's another page. I can't.
Yes,
Yeah.
2 pages.
Okay, let me try.
Then we are left with Venezuela, Eunice and Sonia.
Oh, it's so good to see you. To see
Yeah.
Andy.
Alice, lovely to see you. Yeah.
Yes.
Excellent.
Thanks.
Thanks.
Bye.
Bye bye. Thank you, Leah. Thank you, everyone.
Bye. That's your friends.
Yes, we're friends. We're breast friends. We're breast friends.